Hi everyone, my name's Amy Rose. I'm the Managing Director at the Digital Economy Council of Australia. We are in the thick of it today for the Global Regulatory Digital Asset Summit, and we're taking a 9 or 10 hour or 8 or 9 hour trip around the globe just to dig into what different countries are experiencing on the ground with respect to regulation, what works and what doesn't. And we're going to compare and contrast after the fact after this event, and we'll be sharing some of our findings as well with the industry, maybe some lessons learned or some opportunities that we've gained from the jurisdictions. So today we are at this time looking at Australia. We have had a look at that very broad look at the Australian landscape. We just had a conversation about taxation, which is a really heavy topic, but of primary concern at the moment to industry. Now we're going to talk about custody, which I think is going to come up in some draft legislation eventually, possibly next year. So we have Jaime Lumsden from Hamilton Locke, who will be leading the conversation, Kate Cooper from Zodiac Custody, Alvin Chia from Northern Trust, Rahul, Advani from Ripple, and Albin from BitGo. So the best of the best are in the room, and I'm going to bring them to the stage now. If my tech skills are working. I did fail a little bit earlier on. So here we go. Let's hope for the best. All right. I think you all are good to go. I'll leave it with you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy Rose, for your introduction. Uh, we are going to have a bit of a discussion about custody. And just to sort of set the scene, we thought that we might start with a little bit of a discussion around what custody actually means in a digital asset context and how it might be the same or different to custody in a TradFi sense, because we think that that sort of scene setting is important to having a reasonable discussion around how you develop appropriate regulation for custody in a digital asset context. Rahul, would you like to lead us off with a little bit of an explanation around how custody might be the same or different and what it means for us?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jamie. Just a quick introduction for you. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ripple in a custody context, as you may be aware, Ripple is a leader in enterprise blockchain and crypto solutions, transforming how the world moves, manages, tokenizes, and stores value. So part of our suite of offerings is Ripple Custody, which is the leading enterprise solutions provider in the digital assets custody space. So we work with top tier institutional customers, many who are on this panel, and regulated entities across the world to create secure and enterprise grade solutions that allow them to safeguard, manage, and engage with digital assets. So from a TradFi perspective, custody typically involves the safekeeping of physical or electronic records of ownership of assets like stocks, bonds, precious metals, and custodians in TradFi often manage the administrative tasks related to these assets, such as processing asset transfers, dividend payments, interest payments, corporate actions, what have you. And these custodians are typically large financial institutions regulated under well-established legal frameworks that have evolved over the past few decades. In contrast to that, digital asset custody involves some unique challenges due to the decentralized and pseudonymous nature of blockchain technology. So unlike TradFi, where assets are often held in accounts linked to legal identities, digital assets are stored on distributed ledgers and accessed via private cryptographic keys. So what this means is that the primary responsibility of a digital asset custodian is securing these private keys. Additionally, the technology underlying digital assets allows for new forms of ownership. So for example, fractional ownership, as well as the transfer of assets. So for example, using smart contracts, and these don't have direct equivalents in TradFi. So these differences between digital asset custody and traditional custody highlight the need for a tailored regulatory framework. And in the digital asset space, the security and management of private keys are paramount. The consequences of failure can be immediate, they can be irreversible, leading to significant financial losses. So therefore, regulations must address these unique risks, ensuring that custodians have robust security measures in place and clear protocols for handling key management, loss, and recovery. And regulations must also account for the evolving nature of the technology, such as the use of smart contracts or multi-signature wallets, which introduce new operational risks and legal complexities. So, for example, if a smart contract automatically enforces the transfer of assets under certain conditions, how is liability determined in the event of a malfunction or a hack? Um, you know, Also, the global and decentralized nature of digital assets poses some jurisdictional challenges that are less prevalent in TradFi. So regulatory clarity on how cross-border transactions and custody should be handled is crucial to preventing regulatory arbitrage and ensuring that digital asset markets operate smoothly and securely. So, I believe that custody in the digital asset context differs significantly from TradFi, and developing appropriate regulation for digital asset custody is essential to protect investors, ensure market stability, and foster the growth of digital asset markets. And such regulation must be adaptable, must be technology neutral, and internationally coordinated in order to be effective.
Thanks, Rahul. Was there anyone else on the panel who would like to add to anything that Rahul said, or perhaps opine on whether we think that the regulation, insofar as we know what it is right now or will be, is sort of headed in the right direction, given Rahul's comments around the tailored nature of regulation that we might need for digital asset custody?
Yeah, maybe I could add. So I think something that's unique in not TradFi, but in digital assets against TradFi is that I think it's for the first time you can have multiple controllers of a single asset, right? Whereas in TradFi, everything's at a centralized custodian, and everything sort of happens from there. So I think regulators today, I wouldn't say are struggling, but they have to sort of wrap their heads around, okay, by virtue of this, there'll be concepts like hot wallets, warm wallets, and cold wallets. And then there's also discussions around, what the percentage of allocation should look like across these wallet types, right? So I think for the first time in the space, regulators have to sort of grapple with such requirements. And I think with things that come to that as well, in terms a question that comes to mind are things like, where should the keys be held? Is there a domestic requirement to have the keys to be held domestically? Is there a requirement for majorities to be held by a single counterparty, or should that be split amongst various counterparties, or just in terms of storage of assets, right? So I think if you walk across different jurisdictions, again, I'm coming more from an international operators lens, where we see multiple jurisdictions and regulators putting on different type of frameworks, right? I think we see a spectrum of things all the way coming from, okay, everything needs to be onshore, to the other spectrum where, okay, you can decide how you want to design your custody framework. So I think by and large, if I take a macro perspective, I think these are some of the key highlights and differences against, in digital world against TradFi.
I think you've made a really interesting point there, Albin, which is you sort of made the point that regulators are sort of struggling to wrap their heads around some of these issues. And unsurprisingly, where that is the case, we do have some very hotly debated parts of the proposals that we've seen so far, one of which does relate to onshoring, which you also just mentioned now. Kate, would you like to share your thoughts with us around some of these hot topic points that have come out of consultation to date?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jamie. And I think just to reflect on the challenge that all of us face, not just the regulators, in really understanding this new area, is probably the first time where you've had to bring together deep knowledge of financial services and the financial system with deep knowledge of a new technology. And the two together, there's very few experts in Australia or globally who have deep knowledge of both. Most people will have one if they're lucky. And so I don't think we can underestimate the challenge that represents. And certainly if I reflect on kind of the two hats I'm here with, one is National Australia Bank, where I led digital assets for 2 years. And I'm currently on secondment to Zodia Custody, which is a bank-backed custodian. And I think, in both of those spheres, I can see that challenge playing out. So I certainly think it's incumbent on us as an ecosystem to help support the regulators to understand the complexity that comes to bear there. And I think there are some very hot topics at the moment in Australia that the consultation has kind of borne out, one of which Albin already touched on, which is onshoring of keys and the extent to which actually it's a protection to have keys held onshore. Interestingly, if we look further afield from outside of Australia, where regulation has been in place for 3 years, Japan, actually the Japanese requirements don't require keys to be held onshore. They focused their regulation on a preference for cold storage, particularly. And certainly if you were a customer of FTX at the time of the collapse, you would probably have wanted to have been Japanese because they are the customers who have taken back their assets kind of most quickly. And that's in no small regard thanks to the foresight of the JFSA in mandating a high proportion of assets be held in cold storage. And I think we're likely to see something similar in Australia. Certainly, if we look to other near neighbours, for example, Hong Kong, where interestingly they do require keys to be onshored, and Singapore, where they don't, but each require a high proportion to be held in cold storage. And so I think that that's something that we're likely to see predominant as the regulation becomes clearer over the coming months.
Thanks, Kate. Did anyone else have thoughts on any of the hot topics that Kate has mentioned, or perhaps a new hot topic that Kate didn't mention? I know net tangible assets is one that gets a lot of discussion, if anybody wants to weigh in on that point or something else. No, I might take net tangible assets.
Oh, I was going to say, Jamie, I'm happy to beat that drum. It's certainly, interestingly, I was with the Taiwanese regulator 2 weeks ago, spent 2 hours with them kind of sharing that what we're seeing globally. And their number one question was around capital requirements. And I think in Australia, we're trying quite hard, actually, I think, to get the balance right between protecting consumers, so the NTA requirements being relatively high, whilst also fostering innovation. So making sure that that barrier is not so high that it's completely impossible for any new player to enter the market. And I think, Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're looking at around a proposal of around 5 million Australian dollars from an NTA perspective, which I think we could debate whether that's too high, too low. I'm sure there are members on this panel who have viewpoints there.
Yeah, the last proposal we saw, I think it's capped at 5 million, and it is scalable, which goes to your point of making sure that people will be able to enter into the market. I believe there's a minimum that people need to have. So even if you're sort of scaling up from 0, you kind of can't go below the minimum, but I don't recall what that minimum was. It is definitely a hot topic, and you're right, different people will have different opinions, and their opinions will sort of tend to depend on which side of the fence they're on in terms of how easy or hard it is for them to maintain that NTA. The NTA proposal is not necessarily out of step with other financial services businesses, but of course, even in TradFi, the NTA is nobody's favorite requirement to have to deal with. So even for custodians and fund managers, it gets quite a lot of scrutiny as well. So not new for it to be a hot topic. Any further thoughts?
Jamie, I
anybody?
wanted to chime in here on the topic on the other side of the fence. So I'm from Northern Trust. Good to meet all of you. And basically, when you look at from a TradFi perspective, what we are looking at is to ensure that the custodian, the net asset requirement for crypto custodians, digital asset custodians should be held to the similar level to a TradFi organization. So what we have been pushing for as a TradFi organization is that the bar for NTA to be similar to how you would think about traditional assets. The bar for reason being that the bar for a digital asset custody shouldn't be lower than what we think of traditional assets. And if any, this would then mean that market perception of safety, of how secure the asset is being held might be seen as a lower bar, right? So we want to make sure that we bring them to a same level, if not even safer, to be able to go push hard on the consumer protection message to go out there to share that we are holding our assets in the best way, in the right way, and in a way that you're familiar with in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. Yeah, there's a lot of it here is about consumer confidence, safety, protection, making sure that people know that their assets are well looked after and that there are fallbacks if something goes wrong. I'm just going to circle back to something Kate said, which is that it's not just the regulators who are having challenges wrapping their heads around all these issues, and that it's really hard to sort of find people who have deep knowledge in both of those areas. Certainly as somebody who's coming at this from a financial services expertise perspective, I know that it's been a steep learning curve since 2018 when I sort of delved into this area. And one of the issues that is really challenging, I think, and continues to be challenging because people haven't sort of thought far enough ahead into what the future might hold in this area, which is asset tokenization projects. And at the moment, as of the last time we saw proposals for the regulation, there was a proposal for custody of real-world assets, where those real-world assets are being tokenized in an asset tokenization project. But there are particular challenges that relate to custody of real-world assets that sit behind digital asset projects, which might come as a surprise since in TradFi we already have custody of real-world assets. So what's the problem when you move it into a digital asset context? Alvin, would you like to share with us your thoughts on that particular issue?
Sounds good. Firstly, thanks for having me. I'm Alvin Chia from Northern Trust. I lead our digital asset innovation business for the APAC region. And part of the mandate that we have from a banking perspective is to continue to explore new and emerging asset classes that can serve the needs of our clients in the region. So everyone from sovereign wealth, superannuation funds, our clientele within this segment have been exploring and discussing the potential of being able to tap into real asset tokenization projects. And we have done our own fair share of due diligence and exploration in this area. Today, as part of this panel, I thought we can discuss a bit more about the experience that we had working on one particular RWA type project, which is in the area of carbon credits. So as part of our own market evaluations, we tried to look at a market where the blockchain technology and tokenization process could bring real value into the markets. And we identified that as an opportunity for us to look into and see if how could we potentially hold custody of the new asset class. We did a round of POV and POC and MVP transactions last year. And when we are going through the process, we realized that the technology is really the issue here. The tech is readily available. We have got our tokenization engine where we can then tokenize and we can transact and hold custody of the tokens. However, as we explore going to market and go live with a solution like this, a roadblock that we have encountered is, for example, when we are tokenizing real assets like a carbon credit. In this instance, it's seen as a commodity and it is not within the scope or realm of what traditional banking institutions like us could hold typically. So as part of the process, we had to then go to the regulators in the US, where we are from, to speak to CFTC to explore how can we then bring an asset like this into a tokenized format and for us to hold custody of these tokens in a way that is regulated. And after lots of back and forth, what we then eventually landed on is that instead of viewing this as custody, we then move into a legal structure where we are seeing this as recordizing of the record. So we are recordizing the tokenized carbon credits under our records instead of holding them under custody. And it showcased to us, I think, from this whole experience that we have, the legal and regulatory uncertainty in this area is something that we have to deal with when we're exploring the tokenization of real-world assets and bringing them on-chain. The tokenization process has exposed us to a full spectrum of different asset classes, everything from real estate to wine to art to carbon credits, some of them more than the other. And we can say that the regulation at this point is still quite lagging behind when it comes to being able to hold custody some of these assets. We have different point of view that was discussed earlier as well, regulators having slightly different perspective. For our own experience, after going through the jumping through the hoops with CFTC, we then went to the UK regulator to get approval. But as we look at coming down to APEC, our initial conversations with the Hong Kong regulators and Singapore, for example, these tokenized assets, in particular carbon credits, are considered non-regulated assets, so we can still hold and transact them as necessary. But however, I think regulations will very much catch up in this area, and we have to then look at how we can then be compliant in this area. So I mean, a story, a personal experience of ours to share, to kind of just articulate and unpack the complexity when dealing with real-world assets tokenization project and bring them live into the market.
Thanks, Alvin. It sounds like there's definitely new and emerging issues that people sort of haven't thought through in terms of custody sitting behind tokenization projects. I have a few thoughts that I can share, but perhaps before I do, is there anyone else on the panel who'd like to speak to issues in custody where we're tokenizing real world assets? No? Okay, so I will add a couple of thoughts to what Alvin sort of said. And what I'm actually starting to see is even further than what Alvin's experience is, which is that people are now starting to bring me tokenization projects for things that can't be custodied in a traditional sense. Like there is no sort of, it's not a thing that legal ownership can be transferred of, or the legal ownership is perhaps structured in an unusual way that means that it's not a thing that can be sort of put into custody. Now, I'm sure that eventually we'll come up with some sort of solution for that. And I unfortunately can't talk to any of the specifics of those projects because they are still confidential. But yeah, I was recently asked the question, what is the limit to what can be tokenized on the blockchain? And the answer to that is kind of, there is no limit. You can put almost anything on the blockchain that you can think of. And the blockchain enables us to think of things in ways that we couldn't conceptualize of them previously, because it enables us to be able to transact in an automatic way when those manual transactions wouldn't have made sense. And so now people are having new ideas about the way that they can sort of think about property and ownership of rights and creating new rights that didn't exist before. And that's also a challenge for custody in real world tokenization projects, because it might be a real world asset, but it might not be a thing that can actually be capable of being put into somebody's custody.
I think it's interesting, Jamie. Chris Giancarlo, who wrote the book Crypto Dad, and is well known in the US, and watch this space if Trump becomes president, because we might well see more of him. He talks a lot in that book about Internet of Value, and that the world we're talking about is the world of value, right? And how we digitize value. And so I think it's very true to say that possibilities are almost endless. And one of the things that we talk about a lot at Zodia is that crypto really is just the first wave, and actually the much more material and much more meaningful wave is still to come. None of us know for sure exactly how big and when, but if I were a guessing lady, I'd say certainly within the next 3 years. And so, we're all going to have to get our head around how we trade, transact, hold value, and therefore how we safe keep value. And it's a big topic. I always say to my team, it's like we're in 2005 and we're building the iPhone and the App Store for the first time when there was no iPhone and App Store. We're creating almost from scratch, and I think that's something that's really exciting. It's certainly why I love my job. I learn something new every day, if not every hour.
I think you're absolutely right. These tokenization projects that I'm seeing, it is about creating and tokenizing value where before you could have argued there was value there, but it was inaccessible. There wasn't a way to extract it and trade it in a way that you could make it valuable to people, even though there was intrinsic value there. So I think that point is really quite key to this. And it is new thinking. It's completely new thinking. So we're now trying to think about custody for concepts of value that did not exist before. Let's pivot slightly and let's open up to the whole panel. If anyone has thoughts on how what we know of the proposed Australian framework compares to key overseas jurisdictions, so for example, Singapore, Hong Kong, anywhere else you might sort of, Kate, I think you already mentioned Japan. Do we think that we're doing well? Are we behind the 8 ball? Do we have good ideas, bad ideas? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, perhaps I can add color, one or two. So again, Pico, we operate from an international operator lens. Australia, we have had some coverage here in terms of clients. I think the key contrast in terms of the framework is that there hasn't been any, I would say, concrete layout of frameworks for custody, at least in Australia. Whereas the likes of the other jurisdictions, at least those that are more close with Singapore, Hong Kong, there has been clear registration or licensing regime that has been rolled out. I think Kate has pointed out as well. I think Singapore earlier this year also expanded out to cover some of the custody aspects around that as well. So I think such changes provides clarity from two sides, right? I think one from a operator point of view, companies like us on the panel that are operating a business, servicing clients in the specific jurisdictions, but also for participants in the particular jurisdictions as well as to, okay, whom are the service providers that we can sort of go with without stepping on, or perhaps in the future have some kind of unforeseen enforcement actions that come through both from the participant point of view and operator point of view. So I think regulations is clearly needed, or rather a framework is clearly needed here. And at least from Bitgo's point of view, because we've operated, more than a decade or so, we've always been in tune in terms of what's changing or what's coming. So we are super excited. I think there's been so many dialogues, especially today. I think there's quite a few seminars talking about some of the changes that's come through over the years for Australia. But I think there's some expectations that things could change quite hopefully by next year or so. But I think these are some of the things that we see that's quite different in terms of what we observe here versus the rest of the world.
I guess one of the challenges, Albin and Jamie, is we thought this time last year that this time this year we would have seen regulation introduced, right? So I'm not backwards in coming forwards. And if you read the foreword to our recent policy playbook, which you can download via the Zodia website, you'll know that I'm pretty bullish about the fact that Australia risks being a laggard. And even if I think to the time I recently spent in Taiwan, which really has not done much in the terms of regulation, but the regulators there are moving at pace and anticipating, and they're naming months. They're saying in June next year, regulation will be introduced. And the challenge for Australia is that if we're not keeping up with our near neighbours across APAC, then there are other players who are coming to the party. MICA across the EU, for example. Every time there's clarity, it helps to fuel the maturity, raise the watermark of the industry overall, which helps to drive the economic benefits and the economic outcomes. And as it stands at the moment, Australia is at risk of falling behind the 8 ball there. So I believe quite strongly we need to be moving in order to realise the economic benefit of this new asset class, the first one in 25 years.
Yeah,
Kate,
sorry, I was going to say I've definitely heard that
please.
concern, but you go.
No, Jamie, I just wanted to quickly chime in to say that well, Australia being slightly behind the policy curve has pros and cons as well, right? So we do hope that there will be more champions from the regulators pushing for regulations in the coming months, and it might potentially allow us to then move ahead in a much quicker pace in the next couple of years to unlock the benefits that digital asset could bring.
Thanks very much, Alvin, and to the rest of the panel, because I think we're at time, so we will have to wrap up now.
Thank you so much, everyone. And do you know what, Kate? I've got his book here. I don't know if you can see it. Crypto Dad.
Yeah.
Because it's right next to me.
Crypto Dad is well worth a read.
It is so worth a read. And I was there watching your fireside chat with him in Japan. And yeah, you need to watch his space because he's working very closely with Trump. And if they're setting up shop, getting ready, everything is already done. So, all right, I'm going to love you and leave you all. Thank you so much for joining us for the Global Digital Asset Regulatory Summit. It has been a pleasure. We are going to jump in to consumer protection now. So for all of those attendees, we are just about to begin in about 1 minute and 30 seconds. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.